There's a photograph from 1963 that captures something most people never noticed about Steve McQueen. He's sitting on a motorcycle outside a cafe in Los Angeles, wearing his signature leather jacket and aviator sunglasses. The sun is setting. The bike is polished chrome. Everything about the image screams confidence, control, masculinity. But if you look closely at his hands, really closely, you'll see they're trembling, not from the engine. The bike is off, just trembling. Steve McQueen spent his entire life running, from his childhood, from his past, from the fear that if he ever stopped moving, someone might see who he really was beneath the carefully constructed image. He was called the King of Cool, the most bankable movie star of the 1960s and 70s, the man every guy wanted to be and every woman wanted to be with. He raced motorcycles at speeds that terrified his insurance companies. He did his own stunts. He drove fast cars, flew planes, lived on the edge because the edge was the only place he felt alive. But what the world didn't see, what even his closest friends barely understood, was that all that movement, all that speed, all that carefully cultivated toughness was armor, protection against a vulnerability so deep that Steve McQueen spent 50 years trying to outrun it. This is the story of the man behind the legend, the boy who was abandoned, the teenager who was angry, the actor who became a star but never felt like he belonged, and the quiet moment near the end when he finally stopped running long enough to ask the question he'd been avoiding his entire life. What was I running from? If you went to the movies in the 1960s, Steve McQueen was the definition of cool. He didn't act like other leading men. He didn't deliver long speeches or emote dramatically. He just was, present, authentic, dangerous in a way that felt real rather than performed. In The Great Escape, he rode a motorcycle through Nazi-occupied territory with a confidence that made audiences believe he could actually pull it off. In Bullet, he drove a Ford Mustang through the streets of San Francisco in what became the most iconic car chase in cinema history. In The Magnificent Seven, he barely spoke, but every time he was on screen, you couldn't look away. He had pale blue eyes that could look right through you, a slight smirk that suggested he knew something you didn't, a physicality that came from years of actually doing the things his characters did, racing, fighting, riding. He wasn't classically handsome like Paul Newman or Cary Grant. He was something rougher, more working class, more real. Women loved him. Men wanted to be him. By the late 1960s, Steve McQueen was the highest paid actor in Hollywood, commanding $1 million per film at a time when that was an almost unimaginable sum. He collected motorcycles and cars like other people collected stamps. He raced professionally, dirt bikes, sports cars, anything with an engine. He crashed. He broke bones. He got back up and raced again. He married 3 times. First to Nyla Adams, a dancer and actress, in 1956. They had 2 children, Terry and Chad. The marriage lasted 14 years, but was turbulent, marked by Steve's infidelities and restlessness. Then, Ally McGraw, in 1973, his co-star from The Getaway. That marriage lasted 5 years and ended bitterly. Finally, Barbara Minty in 1980, a model who was with him until the end. He lived in Malibu, rode motorcycles along the Pacific Coast Highway, flew planes out of Santa Monica Airport. He was free, wild, untouchable, or so it seemed. But everyone who knew Steve, really knew him, understood that beneath all that cool, beneath all that toughness, was something broken, something he never talked about, something that went all the way back to the beginning. Steve McQueen was born Terrence Stephen McQueen on March 24th, 1930, in Beech Grove, Indiana. His father, William McQueen, was a Navy pilot who abandoned the family when Steve was 6 months old. Steve never met him, never knew him, spent his whole life wondering what it would have been like to have a father. His mother, Julian, was 17 years old when Steve was born. She wasn't ready to be a mother. She was restless, unstable, more interested in chasing men than raising a child. She left Steve with her parents on a farm in Slater, Missouri, when he was 3 years old. His great-uncle Claude was a tough, hard-working farmer who didn't believe in coddling. He put Steve to work early, feeding animals, hauling water, learning that life was hard, and you survived by being harder. Steve's Uncle Claude was partially deaf and communicated more through actions than words, but he gave Steve something his mother never had: stability, structure, a sense that someone gave a damn whether he lived or died. For a few years, Steve was relatively happy on that farm. It was the closest thing to a real childhood he'd ever have. And then, when Steve was 8, his mother came back. She'd remarried. She wanted her son back. She took him to Indianapolis, then Los Angeles, dragging him through a series of apartments and boarding houses, introducing him to a revolving door of stepfathers and boyfriends who ranged from indifferent to cruel. Steve started getting into trouble, fighting, stealing, running away. He was angry at his mother for leaving him, angry at her for coming back, angry at a world that seemed determined to prove he didn't matter. At 14, he was sent to the California Junior Boys Republic in Chino, a reform school for troubled youth. It was harsh, strict discipline, hard labor, no excuses, but it saved him. The staff at Boys Republic didn't coddle Steve, but they didn't abuse him either. They gave him rules, consequences, and something he'd never really had: consistency. For the first time in his life, someone expected something from him, expected him to show up, work hard, be accountable. And Steve responded. He thrived under structure. He worked in the laundry. He learned trades. He started to believe, just a little, that maybe he wasn't destined to end up in prison or dead in an alley somewhere. When he left Boys Republic at 16, he drifted for a while, worked odd jobs, joined the Merchant Marines, got into trouble, went AWOL, spent time in the brig. Then he joined the Marines. That didn't go much better. He was court-martialed for going AWOL again, spent 41 days in the brig, and was demoted. But something clicked after that. He served out his enlistment honorably, earned his discharge, and when he got out in 1950, he had no idea what to do with his life. He drifted to New York, worked as a towel boy in a brothel, did manual labor, barely scraped by, and then, almost by accident, he took an acting class. Someone suggested it might help with his anger, might give him a way to channel all that energy. Steve figured, why not? He had nothing else going on. He studied at the neighborhood playhouse under Sanford Meisner. He worked with the Actors Studio alongside Marlon Brando, James Dean, Paul Newman, and something unexpected happened. Steve McQueen discovered he could act, not in the theatrical, showy way, but in a raw, honest way that came from somewhere deep. He didn't have to pretend to be tough or angry or hurt. He just was those things. By 1958, he'd landed the lead role in a TV series called Wanted, Dead or Alive. It ran for 3 seasons and made him a star. Hollywood came calling. Steve McQueen, the kid who'd been abandoned, the teenager who'd been sent to reform school, the man who'd never quite fit anywhere, suddenly had everything: fame, money, power, but he still couldn't sit still. By 1963, Steve McQueen was one of the biggest stars in the world. The Great Escape made him an international icon. That image of him on the motorcycle, jumping the fence, even though it was a stunt double for the actual jump, became one of the most enduring images in cinema. He followed it with The Cincinnati Kid, Nevada Smith, The Sand Pebbles, which earned him his only Academy Award nomination, and Bullet, the film that cemented his reputation as the coolest man alive. He formed his own production company, Solar Productions, giving him creative control over his projects. He chose roles carefully. He didn't do romantic comedies or musicals. He played men who were complicated, flawed, often operating outside the law. He was meticulous about authenticity. If his character was a race car driver, Steve learned to race. If his character was a firefighter, Steve trained with real firefighters. He did as many of his own stunts as the insurance companies would allow, and sometimes more than they allowed. He was fearless on camera and off. He raced in professional competitions under pseudonyms. He crashed motorcycles and walked away with broken bones and a shrug. He flew planes, often recklessly, just to feel the adrenaline. By 1974, he was the highest paid movie star in the world. He had homes, cars, motorcycles, planes. He had money, fame, respect. He had everything he'd never had as a child. But success didn't heal the wounds. Steve was difficult to work with. Directors called him controlling, paranoid, impossible to please. He'd rewrite scripts, argue over camera angles, demand more screen time. He wasn't being a diva. He was terrified of being vulnerable, of trusting someone else to tell his story. His marriages suffered. Nyla loved him, but she couldn't compete with his restlessness, his infidelities, his need to constantly prove something to himself. He cheated constantly, not because he didn't love her, but because intimacy terrified him more than any motorcycle crash or plane stunt ever could. When they divorced in 1972, Nyla later said the saddest part wasn't the affairs. It was that Steve never really let her in, never really let anyone in. He'd built walls so high that even the people who loved him most could only ever see the performance. Ally McGraw thought she could reach him. They fell in love on the set of The Getaway in 1972. She left her husband, Robert Evans, for Steve. They married in 1973. But Steve's jealousy and controlling behavior destroyed that marriage too. He demanded Ally give up her career, stay home, be available to him at all times. She complied for a while, but eventually it became suffocating. They divorced in 1978. Steve's children, Terry and Chad, grew up with a father who was physically present sometimes, but emotionally absent most of the time. He loved them, in his way, but he didn't know how to be a father. He'd never had one himself. Terry, his daughter, struggled with addiction and self-destructive behavior. She died in 1998 at age 38 from a respiratory failure related to her struggles. Steve had been gone for 18 years by then, but those who knew the family said Terry had been looking for her father's approval her entire life. Chad, his son, became an actor and eventually found peace. But he later admitted that growing up as Steve McQueen's son meant living in the shadow of a legend who was rarely home and even more rarely present when he was. And through it all, Steve kept moving. Faster bikes, faster cars, more stunts, more movies, more women, more of everything, as if accumulating experiences could fill the hole that had been there since he was a boy watching his mother walk away. It was late 1979 and Steve McQueen was in Mexico. Not for a movie, not for a race. He was there because he was dying. Months earlier, he'd been diagnosed with mesothelioma, a rare and aggressive cancer caused by asbestos exposure, likely from his time in the military or from the fireproof racing suits he'd worn for years. The doctors in Los Angeles had told him there was no cure. They could make him comfortable, but that was it. 6 months, maybe a year. Steve refused to accept it. He went to Mexico to see a doctor named William Kelly, who offered an alternative treatment, coffee enemas, vitamins, a special diet. The medical establishment called it quackery. Steve didn't care. He'd spent his whole life defying odds. He wasn't about to stop now. But the treatment wasn't working. The cancer was spreading. He was losing weight. His breathing was labored. The man who'd once raced motorcycles at 150 miles per hour could barely walk across a room without stopping to rest. One night, Sitting in his small rented house in Juarez, Steve called his son, Chad. They talked for a long time about racing, about movies, about nothing in particular. And then Steve said something he'd never said before. I wasn't a good father. Chad didn't know how to respond. It was the first time his father had ever acknowledged it. I didn't know how, Steve continued. My old man wasn't around, and my mother, she tried, I guess, but she didn't know how either. I thought if I made enough money, bought you guys enough stuff, that would be enough. But it wasn't, was it? Chad's voice was quiet on the other end of the line. No, Dad, but it's okay. It's not okay, Steve said. I know it's not okay. I need you to know I tried. I know I didn't do it right, but I tried. After they hung up, Steve sat in the darkness for a long time. He thought about all the running, all the bikes and cars and planes and women, all the years he'd spent proving he was tough, proving he didn't need anyone, proving he could survive anything. And for the first time in his life, he let himself feel it. The loneliness, the fear, the vulnerability he'd spent 50 years trying to outrun. He wasn't the king of cool. He was just a scared kid who'd never felt like he belonged anywhere. In the final months of his life, something shifted in Steve McQueen. He married Barbara Minty in January 1980. She was 22 years younger, a model who'd met Steve when he was already sick. She knew what she was getting into. She stayed anyway. Barbara later said that the Steve she knew in those final months was different from the legend. He was softer, more open, more willing to talk about the things he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. He started attending a small church near his ranch in Santa Paula, California. Steve McQueen, the man who'd never believed in much of anything except speed and adrenaline, started asking questions about faith, about redemption, about what comes after. He read the Bible. He talked to the pastor for hours. He wanted to believe there was something beyond this life, something that could make sense of all the pain and chaos. In November 1980, Steve underwent surgery in Mexico to remove tumors. The operation was risky. His body was weak, but he wanted to fight. The surgery seemed successful at first. Steve was optimistic. He called friends. He made plans for what he'd do when he recovered. But on November 7th, 1980, just hours after the surgery, Steve McQueen suffered a heart attack. He died at 3:45 a.m. in a clinic in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. He was 50 years old. Barbara was with him. So was his pastor. They said he was at peace at the end. That after a lifetime of running, Steve McQueen finally stopped. Here's what most people never understood about Steve McQueen. The cool wasn't real. It was a performance, a carefully constructed mask to hide the fact that underneath all the leather and chrome and attitude was a boy who'd never felt safe, never felt loved, never felt like he was enough. Steve raced motorcycles because the speed made him feel alive. He did dangerous stunts because the risk made him feel real. He kept moving because stopping meant facing the emptiness he'd been running from since childhood. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't always kind. He hurt people, his wives, his children, the people who cared about him. But he was also a man shaped by abandonment and trauma, trying to survive in a world that had taught him early on that no one was coming to save him. The tragedy of Steve McQueen isn't that he died young. It's that he spent most of his life convinced he wasn't worthy of the love and acceptance he desperately needed. And by the time he finally started to believe he might be worthy, by the time he finally stopped running long enough to let people in, it was almost too late. They held Steve McQueen's funeral on November 11th, 1980, in Ventura, California. It was small, private, just family and close friends. No Hollywood spectacle, no paparazzi, just people who'd known the man behind the legend. His children were there, Chad and Terry, both struggling with the complicated legacy of being Steve McQueen's kids. Barbara, the wife who'd only had a few months with the man she loved, and a handful of others who'd seen past the armor. The pastor spoke about redemption, about how it's never too late to change, about how Steve had spent his final months searching for peace, and perhaps finding it. They cremated his body. His ashes were scattered over the Pacific Ocean, near the coast where he'd raced motorcycles and driven fast cars and lived the life that made him a legend. In the years since, Steve McQueen's films have only grown in stature. Bullet, The Great Escape, Papillon, The Magnificent Seven. He's remembered as the king of cool, the ultimate movie star, the man every generation rediscovers and falls in love with. But perhaps the real legacy isn't the coolness, or the movies, or the iconic images. Perhaps it's the reminder that even the toughest people are fragile underneath. That speed and success and swagger can't fill the holes left by childhood trauma and abandonment. That running, no matter how fast, no matter how far, eventually exhausts you. And that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop. Stop moving. Stop performing. Stop pretending. And let yourself be seen. Steve McQueen spent 50 years running, and in his final months, he finally stood still. Some stories aren't about strength. They're about the courage it takes to admit you're not as strong as everyone thinks. And some stories stay with us forever. If this quiet story touched you, feel free to subscribe and join us for more forgotten American lives.